nirasya sarva sandeham ekikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vidashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jadamano Vritti Prasannananam Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payo Rasho Mudakedato Vande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Namah Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Kulari Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Sevak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gosvami Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Bandhan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Adadanastrinam dantair yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhulisam Janma Janmani Raganugami Bhajanoda Samanasanam Shri Radhaya Saha Sada Smaratam Brajendhum Sri Rupa Charana Kamala Shritapa Chetasam Me Chittam Satam Marukari Yatupada Padme. Oh, let me admit this. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojanavatar Prema Purushottam Sri Gauranga Mahaprabhu and his beloved Parshad, the foremost of Gaudiya Vaishnava Charjas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again today we'll resume our discussion of Padyavali and the verse Tṛṇād sunīcena, and more specifically the quality of taror iva sahiṣṇunā, tolerance like a tree. So in our last class we spoke about how amāninā and mānadena, or respectfulness and non-conceitedness, are the basis of tolerance like a tree. Unless one is free from conceit, and unless one can bear in mind the presence of Bhagavan, the presence of the Ishta Devata within everyone in one's environment, then one will not succeed in tolerating like a tree. One might tolerate unlike a tree for a certain amount of time, but to tolerate like a tree, or more so than a tree, meaning in a manner in which one also sees to the welfare of those who one tolerates without feeling any disturbance within oneself as a result of their offensive or inimical or troublesome behavior. This high standard of tolerance requires to become free from anger, enmity, and so forth towards those who are inimical, which requires recognition of the presence of Bhagavan within them, an absence of attachment to the body, conceit in one's karma and other worldly connections, and requires seeing that everything that is happening in one's life and circumstances is an outcome of one's own past karma that these other persons are only delivering, so to speak. And moreover, we'll discuss now another layer of vision, or another angle of vision, with which one can see the situations that one is asked to tolerate. Or in other words, when the task of tolerating arises, then how should one see those things that give rise to the discomforts, etc., that require tolerance? One way is to see them as the prarabdha karma, and now we'll discuss another way. So I'll pick up from there. A further layer of depth in regard to the vision required for ideal practice of being tolerant like a tree, that is, in regard to perceiving all beings as dwelling places of Sri Bhagavan and instruments in the administration of one's own karma, is indicated in a well-known statement of Brahmadev to Sri Bhagavan in Srimad Bhagavatam. So this is the Tate Nukampam verse. One who can live earnestly, desiring to see your compassion, enduring self-created results to one's past actions, and offering obeisance unto you with mind, speech, and body, is an heir to the abode of mukti, which is interpreted by Jiva Gosvami and Chakravarti Pad as to Bhagavan's feet and prema for him. So there's a number of commentaries on this verse, but the one that's most relevant to the discussion we're having is the one given by Jiva Gosvami in Bhakti Sandarbha, where he says the following: a person who rightly sees the compassion being shown in such and such manner, that is, through all the various reactions one receives to one's past actions, by Prabhu, that is Sri Bhagavan, solely out of unconditional grace at every moment, becomes delighted therein, that is, in the course of experiencing those karmic reactions, fully perceiving and ascertaining that is, the compassion of Bhagavan coming to one through those karmic reactions, and offering obeisance to Bhagavan with mind or speech or the body, becomes an heir to Bhagavan's feet or prema for him. So it's one thing to see that what's happening is coming to me by my karma, and the person who might have treated me harshly or caused a problem for me is actually just an agent being utilized in the deliverance of my karma, so I don't need to bear any inimical attitude towards that person. That's one vision, and now on top of that, here it's being said that one can see the karmic reactions coming to us as being as Bhagavan himself showing us unconditional grace at every moment. Or one can see one's karma as Bhagavan's grace upon oneself and take pleasure in that, so to speak, or find appreciation for that. So fully perceiving and ascertaining that. In other words, it's not just like a belief, oh, this must be Bhagavan's grace, but rather the implication is learning from it or reflecting on it, seeing it, contemplating it, such that one can actually recognize meaning and goodness within it, purpose within it, and then inspired by that recognition of meaning and significance to worship Bhagavan in reciprocation, or which is represented by this act of offering obeisance to him. So here, Sri Jivapad's point is that a bhakta will not see the adversities encountered in one's life as one's prarabdha karma, but rather will see that these are allocated to oneself by Bhagavan himself, through whichever persons and other media he deems fit, as an expression of his unconditional grace. Moreover, a bhakta will actually feel oneself to be blessed by the experience of undergoing these reactions and learning from them, such that one becomes purified, delighted, and further inspired to perform acts of bhakti to Bhagavan that are enkindled by humility, such as offering obeisances to him. By means of this attitude, the adversities encountered in life, which for others are typically felt only to be difficult or miserable circumstances, and which lead often to enmity towards others, are converted into means by which one becomes further impelled on the path of bhakti, and lead not to enmity, but to grounds for a sustained sense of goodwill towards others, whereby one comes closer to the fulfillment and joy that are the fundamental aim of every embodied being. So, broadly speaking, in this regard, the Manusmriti says, one who does not desire to bind, kill, or trouble other living beings, and instead desires good for them all, attains unlimited happiness. In other words, it's the dvesh, or it's the enmity, and it's the negativity towards others that causes us our own dissatisfaction. And fostering goodwill towards others actually makes us happy. And in most cases, it does make other people happy too. So this attitude of being able to foster goodwill towards others comes more easily when one sees that everyone is acting as an instrument of Bhagavan's unconditional grace upon myself. Just as, sometimes if someone delivers us some excellent news, we become very happy not only with the news, but even with the person who brought it to us. Or, even things that are instrumental to or secondary but somehow related to something that is greatly dear to us or that greatly pleases us also become very dear to us and also are recognized to be held with great endearment. Then like that, even others who are, so to speak, delivering one's karma / Bhagavan's grace can be held dear and seen as worthy objects of goodwill, even if the content of what they have to deliver might on some level be perceived as negative or undesirable, but nevertheless valuable and meaningful. Just as in most cases, if we look back at great challenges that we go through in life, while they were difficult while we went through them, typically it's, some of the most valuable lessons that we learned came about through austerity and difficulty, and we can feel great gratitude and appreciation for even some of the persons who might have been instrumental in engineering those difficult circumstances for us. So even if it was unintentional, so to speak, ultimately we can come to find great appreciation and regard, even for persons who might have acted inimically or troublesomely for someone at some stage. So by seeing things and everyone then as agents in the delivery of Bhagavan's grace, one can harbor goodwill towards them, one doesn't need to harbor any enmity towards them. So this is Jiva Goswami's interpretation of the Tate Nukampam verse. So now we're going to discuss Chakravartipad's interpretation, where he goes, you could say, a half step or a bit further in how one can perceive the circumstances in practical life. So Sri Chakravartipad goes a step further in his commentary on this statement of Brahmadev in Srimad Bhagavatam by adding that a bhakta may not even consider the experiences undergone in life, be they adversities or pleasures, to be merely their prarabdha karma or even Bhagavan's grace coming to them in the form of karmic reactions, but rather consider them all to be the direct personal dispensation of Sri Bhagavan to oneself in response to one's actions on the path of bhakti, as a bhakta situated entirely in the shelter of Sri Bhagavan, and not merely a jiva trapped within the confines of the samsaric cycle of action and reaction. So there are many statements where Bhagavan is said to free his bhaktas from the cycle of karma or entanglement in karma. We were reading in the Chaitanya Charitamrita that verse from the Ramayana, where it's explained that Bhagavan Ramchandra vows, I grant fearlessness to anyone who says, I am yours and take shelter in me once. So, to be granted fearlessness, to be accepted into Bhagavan's shelter, can be understood to mean to no longer be subject or under the jurisdiction of karma, but rather to be in the shelter of Bhagavan, to be under the direct jurisdiction of Bhagavan. So then, what happens in one's life, one may not even see it as karma as such, but simply that wherever I am, that's where my Prabhu keeps me. My circumstances, they are as he shall have them, as he may like to have them. And here I find myself. So one simply sees that what is his arrangement for oneself. So it's not that one sees something other than what's, quote, already there, but they recognize it or they regard it as not only karma and not only grace, but rather as his direct care or his direct guardianship of a jiva, or of his bhakta rather. So the question might arise, well, what about when we have to go through hard things? Or what about when we see bhaktas who might well be in Bhagavan's shelter go through, difficult circumstances or be subjected to humiliation or harm or various things in the world? Well, how can we see that as Bhagavan's personal care for his bhakta, so to speak? So that is what Chakravarti Pad explains in this commentary. He says, as one endures self-created reactions or results, that is, the happiness that is presented as an unsought result even of bhakti, and the hardship that a result of aparad against that is against bhakti. So let me just explain here. In other words, he's interpreting the phrase bunjanevatma kritam vipakam, which is conventionally interpreted to refer to karmic reactions. He's saying we won't consider these karmic reactions, we'll just consider these the reactions to my actions on the path of bhakti, which are directly in relation to Bhagavan. So they're not conventional karma as such, they're my actions in my relationship with Bhagavan, because I see Bhagavan in everything, I honor Bhagavan within everything, I'm interacting only with Bhagavan ultimately. So what I do, what comes back to me from that action, that's in the context of my relationship with him. So the results to the actions that I've performed in relation to Bhagavan may bring me pleasure as a secondary outcome. In other words, I'm not performing them just to get pleasure, but they may produce pleasure. I may perform kirtan for Bhagavan, and that may be delightful. But my goal in performing it is not just to enjoy doing kirtan. My goal in performing it is to render worship to Bhagavan. And similarly, I may commit aparad in the course of my attempt to follow the path of bhakti, and I may suffer the result of that. So, while doing so, or rather seeing then also the suffering that I might encounter as a consequence of my own past offenses, then, he says, one shall see that is such happiness and hardship, fully and earnestly as your grace. That is, he'll see even the suffering he goes through as the grace of Bhagavan upon him. Rather than, I worshipped you and everything was great, and then suddenly, even though I was worshipping you, I became poor, or I became injured, or I became, abused, or I became this, or I became that. What happened to God? Is God there? Why doesn't he protect me? Instead of all of that, rather, whatever hardship I was subjected to, that itself was Bhagavan's grace. That itself was Bhagavan's guardianship of me. Not that it was some grounds for me to think that he didn't protect me. I'm taking what is his protection to be not that. So he gives an example. He says, this happiness and hardship undergone in the course of time is simply a result of the grace and so forth of Bhagavan. As a father, from time to time graciously feeds his son milk, and at other times neem juice, in other words, something bitter and unpleasant, and as he from time to time embraces and kisses him, and at other times strikes him with the palm of his hand, in other words, might give him a slap as an act of discipline or, some reason like that. So one considers Like a father for his son, my Prabhu alone certainly knows what is good and not good for me, while I do not. In other words, when do I need some bitter medicine for some, ego I'm not letting go of? I may not be able to recognize that, but when it comes to me, I'll take it that it was due to me and Bhagavan considered it well. So I should also happily accept it. Time, karma, and so forth, nothing at all, nothing of this Mayic world has any just jurisdiction over me. In other words, I'm not seeing these things as my karma, I'm not seeing them as the unfolding of time. Since I am your bhakta, I'm just seeing that he alone graciously causes me to experience happiness and hardship. So, it is not that the happiness and hardship I undergo in life are caused by time or karma and otherwise, but rather caused by my Prabhu himself. And he alone causes me to engage in worship of himself. So earlier we discussed that point of Jiva Gosvami, how essential to the quality of non-conceitedness or non-egotism was seeing that even the bhakti that one renders to Bhagavan is largely to be credited to Bhagavan, or it's only by the grace, the shakti, the association, the opportunity, the paraphernalia, the inspiration, everything provided by Bhagavan that I'm able to perform any bhakti to him. So let him be credited for that bhakti to him. Let him be recognized as the primary source of merit in the expression of the action. So he causes me to perform worship. He also causes me to undergo hardship when it's good for me. And I'll take it that when it happens, that's what's happening, and therefore the hardship I undergo was warranted and was an act of his grace. This is a perspective. This is a faithful attitude towards, in other words, a faithful way of looking at the unfolding of one's worldly life and practical circumstances. With this attitude, a bhakta can sustain equanimity towards all the happiness and suffering undergone in life, seeing it all as a series of appropriate consequences to past actions that are direct expressions of Sri Bhagavan's loving guardianship of his bhakta, and meant only for the bhakta's ultimate well-being. So again, if the central abhideya is samukyata, if intentness upon, awareness upon Bhagavan is the central, foremost, pervading principle of all the teaching of all the Shastra, then this attitude is highly conducive to that, because it gives one a way of integrating that very thing, that very, abhideya pradhan, that very foremost direction of the Shastra into how one conceives of all the practical circumstances, all the day in and day out unfoldings of life. And it does so in such a way that inspires one to also engage in further acts of bhakti, and also to, not to do so or foster such in a way that fortifies a sense of worldly ego, but rather in one that diminishes one. A vivid example of this attitude in practice, and the forbearance, that is tolerance, that it begets, can be observed in the life of Parikshit Maharaj as he is as described in Srimad Bhagavatam. So, you could say the primary narrative frame in the Bhagavatam is that of the Shuka Parikshit Sangvad. So how did this primary narrative frame of the most foremost of all the Shastras come about? What was the attitude of that person who was taught the Bhagavatam? Interestingly, it's exactly this attitude. So after defining a bhakta's quality of forbearance or tolerance in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu as, quote, being of undisturbed mind, even upon encountering causes of disturbance. So this is also very noteworthy, that tolerance is not simply, grudging out difficulty like, performing a tapasya. Rather, it's a quality of mind, principally. Being of undisturbed mind, even while encountering causes of disturbance. So in one sense, it requires quite a lot of education and spiritual development to even have the ability to cultivate this quality. Because without this underlying worldview, there isn't really a scope for even practicing it, because the mind will just immediately become disturbed by difficulties. The ordinary person, they encounter adversities, the mind is disturbed just immediately. So to have a perspective such that one can encounter adversities and not immediately become of disturbed mind, but at least remain of undisturbed mind for enough time to then, put into play, this quality of forbearance, whereby that lack of disturbance can be sustained. That's already an advanced stage, if you will. So Parikshit Maharaj is a grand example of this quality. Sri Rupa cites a statement made by Parikshit Maharaj in the midst of a large assembly of sages, who had gathered because the king had been cursed by the son of a sage named Shamika to die within 7 days from the bite of a snake bird after the king had marginally disrespected the sage when Shamika did not fulfill his request for drinking water as a result of being absorbed in meditation. So these are 3 verses from the first canto. This is Parikshit Maharaj. He says, "For I, of such condemnable action, who am sinful and of mind constantly attached to household affairs, the Lord of the universe, those who have attachment to whom quickly attain fearlessness, became a cause of disinterest, that is detachment from mundanity, the form of which was the curse of a twice born upon me." In other words, he considers that this curse that he received to die within a week, that Bhagavan himself adopted the form of this curse upon him. Rather than, "Oh no, why didn't you protect me from this curse?" or seeing the curse as one thing and Bhagavan as another, he's saying the curse is Bhagavan. The curse, or the cause of death, is the protection. From what? From my mind remaining absorbed in what is non-Bhagavan, of what is non-bhakti. So the cause is actually a solution to my principal problem. In other words, when you define well-being as a state of worldly contentment, then all these conventional problems arise, and they're problems. But when you define the problem as not lacking enjoyment in the world, but rather lacking bhakti, lacking awareness of Bhagavan, then things that can support or impel the mind towards bhakti to Bhagavan may very well also fall in the category of problems or adversities from the perspective of what leads to worldly contentment. So from this attitude, what would be the greatest, misfortune to suddenly be cursed to die within a week, he's saying, this is protection. This is grace upon me. I am of, attached mind. I am of, condemnable action. And now this curse has come upon me. Bhagavan has adopted the form of this curse as a blessing upon me, as a means of uplifting me and protecting me from what is actually my problem, which isn't my lack of getting to live longer in this body. My actual problem is my attachment to perpetually remaining in samsara. So he goes on to say, "O Brahmanas, may Ganga Devi and you all accept me as one who has taken shelter and is of mind fixed upon Isha." That is, the Lord of the universe. That should be the Lord of the universe. "And let the illusion, or takshaka, that is the foretold snake bird, sent by the twice-born, bite me sufficiently." not just bite me, let him get me good. So this shows some boldness or some strength, like, let it come, bring it on, full. And rather, may you all sing narrations of Vishnu. In other words, carry on joyfully. Don't feel that this is any cause of dismay, or don't feel pity for me, or don't be sad about it, or carry on happily singing in praise of this very Vishnu, who himself is coming to me as my death. Let it come and let me sing. And in whatever animation that is birth I meet with after my death, may I have rati for Bhagavan, the Infinite One, attachment to the Mahatmas in his shelter, goodwill towards all, and reverence for the twice-born. So this is significant, or less common, that he prays for goodwill towards all. In other words, he recognizes that, or the hint here is that he doesn't harbor any ill will towards the son of the sage who cursed him. He has no ill will whatsoever. He wants to unreservedly foster goodwill towards everyone. He doesn't foster any enmity as a result of him having to die in this way. He's ready for it, and he wants only rati for Bhagavan. He wants only further association with the sadhus. He wants goodwill towards everyone. So this tolerance like a tree is shown here, because he's fully accepting the hardship that he's due, and he's also fostering, no disturbance of mind because of it. He's in a strong, healthy state of mind, and he has goodwill towards everyone involved, including even the agent that's the cause of his death. So in these prayers, it can be observed that Parikshit Maharaj accepted even a curse of death, which came to him as a reaction for a misdeed he performed, as a direct act of Bhagavan's grace and guardianship over him. So what's also nice about this example is that it's simple in that he performed an act and he got a curse. It's not a question of which act caused what reaction. In conventional life, we suffer through our karma, the karma that's coming to us now. Did we perform it earlier in this life? Did we perform it in our last life? Did we perform it a million lifetimes ago? It's difficult to say with complete certainty. So here we have a case where it's very clear that this particular act produced this exact reaction. So knowing very well the action that he performed and knowing very well the reaction that came to him, he's seeing it as a direct act of Bhagavan's grace and Bhagavan's guardianship over him. Seeing the curse in this way, he did not become inimical to the person who cursed him, upset, or lacking in equanimity and contentment. Moreover, he indeed felt himself to be blessed and highly benefited from the curse, by seeing it as Bhagavan's grace upon him and responding to it by deepening his resolve to further devote himself to Sri Bhagavan. And we could add, by seeing it as Bhagavan's grace upon him for the purpose of removing him of any residual worldly attachment. I should add that clause. As a result, he spent his last 7 days fully engaged in hearing the glories of Sri Bhagavan, and thereby attained a most exalted spiritual destination. All right, so let's sum up what we've gone over so far. In summary, a bhakta's equality towards happiness and suffering is the basis of a bhakta's being non-inimical, friendly and compassionate towards all beings. And sustaining equality towards happiness and suffering entails seeing all beings as dwelling places of Bhagavan, as worthy objects of empathy and goodwill, and as instruments in the delivery of one's own prarabdha karma, in the expression of Bhagavan's grace, and in the dispensation of Sri Bhagavan's personal guardianship of his bhakta. So, to be tolerant like a tree, we have to tolerate as well as be non-inimical and kind to those who cause us difficulty. So that's only possible if, first of all, we don't have the conceit or the attachment to the things that are being threatened by the cause of needing to tolerate. And second of all, if we can see that cause as being pervaded by Bhagavan and being a worthy object of honor, of goodwill, and of being only an instrument in grace and karma and protection coming to me, then we can have an equanimity of mind, or we can remain equal in the midst of whatever ups and downs we go through in the course of tolerating those unfolding of events. So to sustain and act in accord with such equanimity, however, the quality of forbearance, that is tolerance, is indispensable, as is indicated by Bhagavan Sri Krishna in Bhagavad Gita 12:13, which we discussed earlier, and the example of Parikshit Maharaj amply illustrates this quality, as does a tree by tolerating heat, cold attacks, and so on, as was described in the aforesaid passages from Chaitanya Charitamrita in regard to the verse under discussion. So all told, nevertheless, it's going to hurt. Or in other words, there are going to be actual difficulties that aren't going to feel pleasant. There is going to be some practical pain, just to put it in the bluntest terms, along the path. It's not that you're going to walk on this path and the entire thing is going to be a smooth ride without any degree of difficulty. There's going to be some discomfort felt along the way. There's no way around that. So with all of these principles in place, one can undergo that discomfort in such a way that it leads to high spiritual benefit for oneself, rather than just making you miserable. So in other words, ultimately, it's not that you're going to literally free yourself from having to undergo some difficulties in life, but rather you can restructure your whole attitude and way of seeing life in such a way that you end up feeling a deeper sense of fulfillment and satisfaction, spiritual growth, and ultimately higher spiritual attainment as a result of those difficulties, rather than in the case of a person not on the spiritual path, undergoing those difficulties in such a way that it only fortifies their samskaras for anger and revenge and, further pursuits of ego-aggrandizement, such that it further enmeshes them in the mundane. Bhagavan Sri Krishna also describes these qualities in trees, as he speaks in praise of the trees of Brajadam amongst his friends one day while sitting in the shade they provided from the sun. So returning to the illustration in the verse of the tree, then we can see how dear trees are to Krishna himself, as one day he's sitting with his friends under the tree and he speaks about these qualities of a tree that are what we're talking about in this section. So he says, "See these greatly fortunate trees, whose lives are completely dedicated to the welfare of others. Tolerating the wind, rain, heat, and snow, they protect us. Aho, the birth, which is a source of sustenance for all beings, of they from whom, like a good man, that is a devout host, seekers never go away disappointed, is exalted. With their leaves, flowers, fruits, shade, roots, bark, wood, fragrance, sap, ashes, core, and sprouts, they fulfill the desires of everyone." In other words, with every faculty they've got. "Constantly acting for the welfare of all embodied beings in this world, with one's vital airs, resources, intelligence, and words. This much is the success of an embodied being's birth." So very admirable, sounds great, very good, but still someone may say that's hard, and how is that really sustainable? So let's come back now to Vishwanath Chakraborty's commentary on the Gita, where he also, again, repeatedly raises many practical considerations to all these noble ideals. So while such selflessness as exhibited by trees is undoubtedly praiseworthy, one may still wonder how a human being can practically sustain one's life if one actually acts as these trees do. Sri Chakravartipad thus raises an insightful practical objection in his commentary on Bhagavad Gita 12.14. Quote, well, how shall such a bhakta's livelihood be sustained if they treat even inimical persons with friendliness and compassion and forbear even being beaten up by them? So to that, Bhagavan says, contented, santushta. One is content with foods obtained of their own accord, that is, given without having been solicited, or obtained with some, meaning in no way protracted or excessive effort. So the quality of contentment, surprise, surprise, was also alluded to in the explanation of this Tṛṇād verse in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, which we discussed earlier, where it said, as a tree does not say anything when cut, and when drying up and dying still does not beg for water, so a Vaishnava should not beg anything from anyone, and rather accept only unsolicited subsistence or eat greens and fruits. One should always take the name and foster content in accord with attainment, that is, be satisfied with whatever is encountered. Bhagavan Sri Krishna stresses the importance of this quality of contentment by mentioning it for a second time in the same section of the 12th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, where he enumerates the qualities of his bhaktas by describing his bhakta as, quote, contented with whatever comes. Santushta yena kena chit. Sri Baladeva Vibhushan Pad, in his commentary on this statement, gives the example of being satisfied with whatever food is brought to oneself by destiny, be it dry or succulent. Following Sri Samipad, he further describes one who is in this way, quote, ever contented, or santushta satatam, as being, the word is prasanna chitta. So prasanna you could take to mean bright, or clear, peaceful, pleased, kindly disposed mind. So in other words, they tolerate whatever comes with a smile on their face, with a bright face. Not that they're grinning and bearing it, so to speak, but rather with a bright face, they're tolerating this. The principle underlying this quality is that if one can sustain a sense of inner contentment in the midst of ongoing external austerity, then one will not, if one cannot do that, then one will not succeed in forbearing the austerities one encounters as a result of one's past actions, and remain favorably disposed towards all beings, including even those who are instruments in bringing those adversities for oneself as a consequence of one's past actions. Sri Samipad further defines the inner contentment, or another word is santosh, spoken of here in the Gita and the Charitamrita as, quote, a sense of enough or sufficiency with that which is attained by destiny. In other words, what comes, that's enough, that's sufficient. You know, the word in Sanskrit is alam, or what's called alam buddhi, a sense of enough. In other words, sufficient. Sometimes in modern, colloquial Bengali, they have this phrase bas, which is a colloquial equivalent to the Sanskrit word alam, which means enough. Like, I don't need more, that's enough. And both in Sanskrit and in Bengali, it can also have the negative force of like, enough! In other words, stop it. But the sense of it isn't here. It's not, in other words, stop, I don't want any more of this. It's just saying, I've had plenty, it's good, I'm not opposed to it, but what's come is sufficient, there isn't any more required. So in this sense, it can be that with what comes, one partakes to this extent that is required and not more. And also, what comes, one will consider, that's enough. It might seem like maybe too little, but somehow or another it'll do. So from both sides, in other words, it balances out both, and too much and too little, by sustaining a sense of inner balance, by being content with whatever amount that it is. So this quality is praised in the Bhagavatam in many places. So I have a few examples. In Srimad Bhagavatam, Devarshi Narad compares such inner contentment to a pair of shoes. So this is interesting because, especially in Sanskrit literature, feet and shoes are typically not, unless in the case of Bhagavan or Mahatmas, are not usually an object of comparison. Or in other words, they're not usually something that you compare something to in order to praise what you're describing. But this is an interesting case where something is praised even by comparing it to shoes, and not shoes worn by Bhagavan, but shoes worn by anyone. So he says as follows, all directions are auspicious for one who is always of contented mind. Just as there is safety from rocks, thorns, and so on, for one with shoes on one's feet. So maybe in the modern day, if you live in a country where everyone conventionally wears shoes, then this might be so common that you don't realize how convenient it is, or that it wasn't always this way. But rather, for those who are acquainted with what it's like to walk long distances barefoot and not possess shoes, and have to, suffer cuts on their feet and watch out carefully whenever walking through forests and so on, then suddenly to acquire this thing called shoes would be amazing, because you could, with such a lesser degree of concern and a greater degree of, liberty, go wherever you wanted with, a freedom of mind. So just as when someone has this amazing invention called shoes, one can move around very free-spiritedly, then similarly when one has this inner insulation, if you will, of the capacity to remain content, then one can move through the flux of uncertainty called life and be fine, and see that whatever comes from whatever direction is all right. Vamanadev similarly explains to Bali Maharaj in Srimad Bhagavatam that without this quality of inner contentment, one will never find satisfaction, no matter how much one attains externally. So this is what you call the Vyatirek. I've given the Anvaya example and the Vyatirek example. In other words, praise of its value, of its utility, and then indication of the consequence of lacking it, such that one understands that it's indispensable. If you don't have it, you have a problem that you really don't want, and when you do have it, you have a great deal of facility that's very worthwhile having. So he says, one who is contented with that which is attained of its own accord is happy. One who has not controlled oneself, that is one's mind, is not contented even upon having attained the three worlds. Discontentment with wealth and enjoyment, after attaining them, is the cause of an embodied being's transmigration in samsara. Contentment with that which is attained of its own accord is known to lead to mukti. In other words, if you don't have this quality, you'll be perpetually dissatisfied and bound in samsara. Unless and until you can manage to find content with whatever comes, unless and until that, you won't feel peaceful and you won't have a way to transcendence. Bhagavan Sri Krishna thus describes not a person devoid of resources, but a person beset with discontent as poor in this world. Daridra yastu asantushta. So to be poor is to be discontent with what you have. In other words, you might not have much, but if it's enough for you, then you're rich. In other words, you have all that you need. You have everything, all your needs, all your ends meet. But no matter how much you have, if you're not content with it in your mind, then you suffer from, anxiety, unease, perpetual upwelling of more desires, and so on and so forth. Devarshi Narad describes the inverse, inner contentment, as real wealth in Mahabharata. So again, the flip side, desire has no end, contentment is the greatest happiness. Therefore, the wise see contentment alone as the wealth in this world. So you don't need more stuff, you just need to learn how to be content. And then you'll be perfectly happy with whatever you got. So this doesn't suit, increasing, GDP of whatever country you live in, or, the, consumer economy. So it doesn't get much, support in the modern flux of popular culture, if you will. But nevertheless, it definitely has a subcategory, even among persons who are following the bhakti path, but even persons, following a loose notion of spiritual culture or self-help, in relatively modern times, they have this kind of minimalism aesthetic of people learning to cultivate minimalism, which is basically another way of acquiring a certain degree of this kind of contentment, albeit in an entirely worldly sense, is not what's being referred to here, but nevertheless illustrates that it does have immense practical value, that even people who don't pursue entirely transcendental or spiritual ideals nevertheless find great benefit in such a practice, even on you could say, a smaller scale. So if they can benefit from it in that level, then how essential and how much valuable is it for a bhakta? Then we can say even more. Sri Chakravarti Pad also raises a question in his commentary on Bhagavad Gita 12:14 in regard to this quality of contentment in a bhakta. How can a bhakta be said to feel contentment in the case of acquiring something that is useful, such as food, when it was said earlier that a bhakta remains equal towards suffering and happiness? So this is perhaps a little bit pedantic, but earlier this sama sukha dukkha was said, that the bhakta is equal towards happiness and suffering. But now you're saying he's content, so isn't that a contradiction? If he's just equal, then how is it that he's also content, which would register in the positive? So he resolves this query by saying that the following quality mentioned by Bhagavan Sri Krishna in the Gita, that of a bhakta's being a yogi, which he interprets to refer to someone who is engaged in bhakti yoga, indicates that a bhakta accepts and feels contentment with whatever favorability they meet with along the path of bhakti for the sake of accomplishing bhakti. Meaning, the contentment a bhakta feels is not self-centered and independent of intentness upon Bhagavan, but rather based on bhakti, the ultimate focus of which is the satisfaction of Bhagavan. And feeling contentment or happiness because of Bhagavan's happiness is a quality rather than a fault. So, equality towards sukha and dukkha, that's one's own sukha and dukkha. But contentment with what comes to one that enables one to then further pursue the pleasure of Bhagavan, that doesn't contradict the quality of being equal to things as they pertain to oneself, because it's not self-centric, it's Bhagavan-centric. This is how he resolves the dilemma. Although, from another perspective, you could also say that there isn't necessarily a contradiction in that the equality could, in other words, be equated with a sense of contentment. But that's another way of looking at it. Moreover, in Sri Chakravarti Pad's view, Sri Krishna goes on to say in the Gita that a bhakta is, quote, self-restrained, or this is the next quality mentioned, yatatma, because they remain undisturbed even in the case of not acquiring food or other elements that are favorable to their practice of bhakti. And even if as a result of their past karma, in some form or another, they do become mentally disturbed by difficulties they face, such as a lack of food, then they do not resort to practicing Ashtanga Yoga or other means of subduing mental unrest, because they are of firm conviction, Dhrida Nishchay, that one-pointed bhakti to Sri Bhagavan is their sole responsibility. So, the bhakta is always content, and when they encounter these difficulties, then they're also able to sustain a degree of self-restraint when they undergo these practical difficulties, which mentally they can remain content about, but nevertheless may feel some physical hardship as a result of, then they're able to a certain extent to bear that, or to retain a degree of composure or self-control, even in the midst of the physical difficulties of it. But should the physical difficulties mount to the point of producing mental difficulties, or when they become difficult to bear, in other words, then the person doesn't resort to some exterior means of quelling them. He gives the example of doing Ashtanga yoga, but rather remains, only engaged in bhakti because they have very firm conviction in the value and the efficacy of the process they're performing. So in other words, they don't resort to, you could say, painkillers, if you will, or distracting elements, things that can, at an intermediate level, reduce a certain degree of stress or difficulty that one might undergo, but don't have a direct bearing or don't directly pertain to the ultimate path and aim that one is seeking to achieve. So in other words, they keep it integrated. They keep it all in line with what will keep the mind and keep the sense of focus fixated towards Bhagavan, towards bhakti, and so forth. Which brings us to the final quality listed in these para verses in the Gita that we've been discussing for a while now, which is said to be the basis of all of the qualities discussed so far, and which is a very important point from a practical perspective about how a sadhaka can approach all this discussion, because it's relatively easy to sit here and read this analysis and see the logic of it, but to actually live this way, at least in my case, is, I can say is no easy task, and to foster the kind of composure and contentment and so forth as described here is sometimes difficult when, you're fasting or you're subject to stresses that are coming to you unexpectedly from forces outside of your control. It's not always easy to retain these things, and in the moment, in the heat of the battle, so to speak, to live through or execute the ideals that one cherishes. So how that fundamentally can be practiced or worked at day by day, how one can make small steps little by little on this type of path, that's what a final point will come and we'll discuss in the next discussion. So I'll stop here for today. If anyone has comments, questions, anything else, please feel free to share. Yes? Yes, please go ahead. I see your hand. Okay, I don't hear anything.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hello?
I hear you.
Okay, very good. Just a moment. Do you still hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, fine. First of all, a few thoughts I have while listening to this interesting elaboration. First, what came to mind is, like you say, alarm. For one person, enough is not enough, same as for somebody else. So everybody has one's own enough. So that's more degree into discuss this one point. Like what actually is being said by enough? Is this one's own self-satisfaction? Is there any measure to it, or just simply based on one's own sincere judgment, self-judgment? And if this is the case, the whole discussion, I think, it's very closely ties to whole process of Tṛṇād. And I was wondering if there is any anything that Jiva Gosvami, Rupa Gosvami, and commentators bring to picture that Sharanagati, that actually all this discussion ties very closely to Sharanagati. Or are they discussing this in isolation, all these items that we just discussed in the last few days?
That's what will come in the next discussion.
Okay.
That point will come as the what do you call it, the basis for these things. So yes, it is there.
Yeah, that's great waiting for you for that.
And also, I saw in the chat there was a question from last class saying that staying equal towards happiness and suffering, if one finds oneself emotionally affected in the middle of distressful events and experiences the emotions of sadness and sorrow, does this mean that this happens because in those moments one identifies oneself with the false self and forgets to identify with the jiva's essential nature? So to that I'll say there can be a variety of scenarios, and when one identifies or when one is considering a perspective in which one conceives of the self as, the jiva who's inherently a part of Bhagavan, a servant of Bhagavan, when one thinks from the perspective of being a bhakta of Bhagavan, then there will be emotions of happiness and sadness. Both, because some things are pleasing to bhaktas, some things are saddening to bhaktas. And if one identifies with merely, a sense of being a human being or just a person in a circumstance that went through something difficult and feels, distress or sadness because of that, and at the time they're just, so to speak, identifying with the full self or just with the body in a very ordinary way, then there also may be a type of sadness, and that's another category. In other words, a bhakta may aspire to many spiritual ideals, and if they perform an act which is contrary to their ideals, or which is what might be called falling away from their ideals, then that might be very saddening to them. But that very act, for an ordinary person, might be a party. It might be, something that's fun or something that's considered enjoyable. So what might be sadness from an identity perspective of a bhakta would be a cause of pleasure for a person who's, just pursuing some sensual enjoyment at a given moment. This is just one example. Even we see among Bhagavan's parikaras, they experience the most intense bliss out of anyone. They also experience the most intense sorrow out of anyone. If there's anyone who's experienced the most extreme state of sorrow, it's, Mahabhav Swarupani Sri Radha Thakurani. Right? There's the verse in the Ujjal Nilamani where she's suffering in separation from Krishna so acutely, and I think it's Vishaka or one Sakhi is speaking to her and can see that Radharani is undergoing extreme difficulty, and she asks Radharani how she feels, and Radharani says that this pain of separation is burning inside me so intensely that if I were to even cough and let a little smoke of the fire that's going on inside me out, it would burn the three worlds to ashes. So I'm trying to keep it in so that the whole world doesn't get destroyed. Something like this is, I'm rendering it a little bit loosely, but to demonstrate that for bhaktas who undergo union and separation from Bhagavan, they undergo the most ultimate range of emotions, the widest spectrum of emotions, if you will. And it's also explained that in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, that even that dukkha or suffering or sorrow that they undergo is at the same time also constituted of spiritual bliss, or it's because its underlying ultimate cause is Krishna, and Krishna is, defined, or the constitution of his existence is said to be supreme bliss, then even that most tremendous sorrow is also a type of bliss, so to speak. But how that peculiarity arises is something that can only be felt. So anyway, that's not the main point that is in the question, but I just use that as an example to say that there is a range of emotion, of positive, negative, or happiness and sorrow from any sense of identity. And depending on, the sense of identity, then there'll be a particular category of sorrow that may arise related to that. So that's sort of the point in a very broad matter. But in a more practical sense, for a sadhaka who may be, making their way gently along the path, then it may be common that, much of the sadness that we undergo is based on a lack of identification with the self that we aspire to, so to speak, and largely arises from our attachment to the false self and the various pursuits, desires, possessions, etc. associated with it. So conventionally, that's the case for persons without spiritual knowledge and spiritual practice in their life, and also for many sadhakas who may be, yet to have become highly advanced in the process. And even we hear that for even very advanced sadhakas, to be 100% of the time, 24 hours a day, free from any sense of self or action in relation to the body, is almost impossible and extremely rare. So we don't need to be, you could say, excessively concerned if from time to time, for practical reasons, there are some degree of reference to that, if you will. But in the main, obviously, we want to cultivate a sense of identity as a bhakta of Bhagavan, as a jiva situated in Bhagavan's shelter that belongs to him, that's his inherent part, and who aspires to be one of his, assisting eternal associates. This sense of identity was, as we discussed, the maturation of the quality of being free from conceit, or being free from ego, is to be steeped in that ideal sense of self. And the more that we advance in the path, the more that sense of identification and thinking through, and then thus processing, acting and feeling emotions from that identity perspective will gradually increase as one advances along the process of sadhana. So I hope that is sufficient to address that point. If not, let me know.
Thank you, Baba.
All right, so we can conclude here, and next we'll discuss the fundamental basis of how these qualities are cultivated and how they can become fortified in the psyche, how they can become fortified into practical, to practically manifest in our lives, having understood their importance and how they work together in the discussion so far. So I conclude here. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Nama. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Radhe Shyam.
Jai Shri Radhe.
Jai Shri Radhe Shyam.